The refrigerator door stood still for decades, a silent witness waiting to be opened. But on June 23, 1965, that stillness broke for a Houston police officer who swung the door upward. At first, what he saw looked like piles of raw meat. Then, something caught his eye through the crispers. Two heads tucked away like forgotten groceries. What lay behind them was far more disturbing. Inside that kitchen at 1815 Triskel Street, officers found Fred and Edwina Rogers, an elderly couple whose lives ended in violence and whose remains were cut apart and placed inside their own refrigerator. The scene sent ripples through the city and carved a place in true crime history. But while their bodies were discovered, the person who matters most vanished. Their son, Charles Frederick Rogers, was the last person known to be in that house. A highly educated man, trained in nuclear physics, a former Navy pilot, and once a seismologist, he shared the home with his parents, but rarely spoke to them. By the time police arrived, he was gone. Nothing, not a fingerprint, nor a confirmed sighting, ever tied him to a location after that day. Law enforcement issued warrants, launched searches, and even called in a nationwide manhunt. But Charles Rogers simply disappeared, eventually declared legally dead a decade later. The question remains, what happened on Father's Day that led to this atrocity, and where did Charles go? Fred Christopher Rogers and Edwina Ivor Rogers were fixtures on Driscoll Street in Houston's Montrose neighborhood, an elderly couple whose lives, at first glance, reflected quiet routine rather than tragedy. Fred, born in 1884, had long since retired from active work, and Edwina, born in 1922, kept the rhythms of daily life steady and predictable. Theirs was the sort of life built around habit, familiarity, and the kind of domestic calm only years together can create. Their neighbors pictured them on warm afternoons, sitting on their porch or tending to simple tasks inside their modest home. Inside that house, on the surface, nothing seemed remarkable. The walls echoed with the tick of clocks and the drip of everyday life. The kitchen table was set for another quiet meal. The air carried the faint aroma of home-cooked food. On the afternoon of Father's Day, June 20th, 1965, routine should have played out as it had for decades. A shared meal, perhaps a phone call with extended family, then rest. Yet that Sunday afternoon became the last day they were ever known to be alive. Their adult son, Charles Frederick Rogers, lived with them but was unlike the typical family member. A man of paradoxes, Charles was exceptionally educated. He had earned a degree in nuclear physics, served as a Navy pilot during World War II, and later worked as a seismologist. Yet, despite these accomplishments, he rarely spoke to his parents and moved through the world with a quiet detachment that others found difficult to interpret. Locals barely noticed him most days. He rose early, left before dawn, and returned after dark, often cooking his meals alone in his room. It was only through notes slid beneath the parents' bedroom door that anyone knew the three shared a household. In the weeks leading up to June 20th, the daily rhythm continued without anything outwardly unusual. The ticking clocks, the rustle of newspapers, the conversations over breakfast, they all played out exactly as they had for years. Then, the door closed behind them for the last time. Fred and Edwina's final movements, their last words, and their last moments remain unknown. There were no eyewitness accounts of discord, no sudden phone calls hinting at trouble, no neighborhood disturbance that summer Sunday. All that remained was the mundane normalcy of an ordinary day and silence in its aftermath. By June 23rd, a relative, alarmed by unanswered calls, asked police to check on the couple, unaware of how drastically their world had changed. The house was quiet. Dinner sat on the table, and the routine life Fred and Edwina had built was already gone, replaced by a mystery that would grip Houston for decades. When Houston police finally stepped into the Rogers home on June 23, 1965, their response was urgent. A welfare check had been requested because the elderly couple, Fred and Edwina Rogers, hadn't been heard from in days. Officers expected an unremarkable call, but almost immediately they encountered details that didn't add up. Things inside the house looked undisturbed. Breakfast dishes on the table, a television schedule left open, belongings neatly placed as though they had simply been left for a moment. But as detectives pushed deeper into the home, the situation unfolded into something far darker and far more complex than a simple welfare check. Investigators quickly realized this was not a typical missing persons case. The couple's dismembered bodies had been placed inside the refrigerator and found during the search, an unsettling discovery that instantly shifted the focus to homicide. Police began collecting evidence and trying to piece together what had happened on Father's Day, when the murders were believed to have occurred. At first, detectives considered several ordinary explanations. Could this have been a robbery gone wrong? Or perhaps a domestic dispute that spiraled out of control? But something didn't match common patterns. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, suggesting that whoever was responsible might have been invited in or already lived there. A crucial early piece of evidence was found in Charles Rogers' bedroom. Investigators discovered blood in his room and a saw with what appeared to be blood stains, raising immediate questions about his potential involvement. But there was a significant problem. Charles was nowhere to be found. When officers searched the house, he had already vanished without leaving any clear trail behind. Police combed through the house, interviewing neighbors and friends to track his last known movements. Some people remembered seeing Charles around the neighborhood in the days before the discovery, but none of these accounts led to solid sightings after the crime. Rumors began to circulate, but nothing confirmed his location. Investigators publicly identified Charles as a person of interest and swiftly issued a warrant for his arrest as a material witness. But week after week, he remained missing. The trail grew cold as leads dried up. Each interview with a potential witness brought new theories, but no answers that could definitively pinpoint Charles's whereabouts. Investigators also examined the nature of the crime itself. The way the bodies had been handled suggested a level of precision and calculation that raised questions about the perpetrator's state of mind and abilities. While there was evidence that tools inside the house may have been used, professionals at the time struggled to determine whether this pointed to specific training or whether it simply reflected a meticulous effort by someone determined to cover their tracks. As days turned into weeks, the energy around the case evolved. Initial urgency gave way to frustration. Hopes for a breakthrough in the first crucial days diminished as each lead faded without resolution. The community watched as law enforcement followed every promising clue and saw each one fail to produce the answers the public craved, and the leads stopped. In the weeks that followed, the case became emblematic of investigative dead ends, an unresolved tragedy where the suspect disappeared without a trace, and the evidence raised more questions than it answered. In the summer of 1965, Houston detectives raced against time to unravel one of the most baffling murder investigations the city had ever seen. But as the weeks wore on, the urgency that once powered every lead and tip began to fade. Initial momentum gave way to frustration as the trail of evidence dried up, and both investigators and the public felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing in on them. At first, the discovery of Fred and Edwina Rogers' bodies inside their own home drew intense scrutiny. Officers had arrived expecting a routine welfare check. A concerned relative had reported unanswered calls. Instead, they found a scene that seemed to defy easy explanation. Within days, Charles Rogers, the couple's reclusive son and now the primary suspect, was nowhere to be found. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed anyone who might have seen him, and issued warrants, but he had already slipped beyond reach. As summer faded into fall, interest from the local press and community began to wane. Without a captured suspect, without a confession, and without new evidence to guide them, law enforcement grappled with a shrinking pool of leads. Detectives who had once worked around the clock found themselves retracing old ground, hoping that a forgotten detail might suddenly illuminate Charles's path, but nothing materialized. For Fred and Edwina's extended family, the silence was a heavier burden than the violence of the crime itself. They were left to wrestle with the same impossible questions night after night. Did Charles kill his parents? If so, what drove him to act? Was he lost to his own unraveling mind, or had he escaped justice entirely? Without closure, every passing day was a reminder of how much they did not know. Meanwhile, police maintained a nationwide search effort, sending bulletins to law enforcement agencies across states. Descriptions of Charles were circulated widely, and officials remained hopeful that someone, somewhere, might recognize him. Yet no dependable tip ever emerged. Decades later, Charles would be declared legally dead in July 1975 because he had not been seen in years, a stark, bureaucratic acknowledgement of a mystery that refused to resolve. Over time, the Rogers case shifted from headline news to cold case file. Public fascination gave way to nagging curiosity. That curiosity grew into speculation, some grounded in facts, others fueled by the gaps in the record, but none led to definitive answers. In the absence of hard leads, theories emerged about where Charles might have gone, how he might have lived, and whether he remained alive at all. Yet none of these possibilities could replace the tangible evidence that investigators lacked. Today, the case remains officially unsolved. The questions that drove the initial investigation, who killed Fred and Edwina Rogers, and what became of Charles, still echo in the minds of those who study it. What began as a frantic search gradually fell into silence, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty that police, family members, and true crime followers continue to confront decades later. Even as the years passed, the Rogers case did not settle into neat explanations. Instead, it became a mosaic of unanswered questions, shadows of motives, and speculation that resisted closure. Detectives, writers, and amateur sleuths have all offered theories to explain how a loving couple's life could end with such brutality, and how their son, who was suspected of involvement, could vanish without a trace. But after decades of speculation, none of these ideas has been proven, and no single theory fully accounts for what occurred in that Houston home in June 1965. One of the earliest theories investigators and locals considered was financial strain. Charles Rogers was well educated and had professional experience as a geophysicist, but reports indicate that he had difficulty holding steady employment in later years and lived quietly with his parents. Some researchers have suggested that persistent money problems may have created tension within the household. Questions arose. Were Fred and Edwina providing financial support that Charles resented? Were their debts unresolved, or resources being drained in ways that frustrated him? Some who have studied the case believe that ongoing financial pressures, real or perceived, might have strained relationships behind closed doors, eventually erupting into violence. A second theory focuses on emotional conflict and resentment. Those who knew Charles describe him as intensely private, socially withdrawn, and sometimes difficult to understand. His relationship with his parents was reportedly formal and distant. Communication often took place through notes rather than conversation. Some accounts from neighbors and family members hint at tension and unhappiness, though details are scarce. In this view, long-standing emotional strain, accumulated misunderstandings, frustration, and unresolved conflict may have contributed to an explosive outcome. Viewed this way, the murders are seen as the tragic end of a family dynamic that had been deteriorating for years. A more unusual line of speculation has emerged over time, not rooted in official investigation, but circulating in fringe discussions among true crime enthusiasts, that Charles Rogers might have had connections or involvement in events outside Houston, including broader historical mysteries. One example is speculation around his background and the timing of his disappearance shortly after the killings. Some have pointed to his scientific training and suggested links to unrelated national narratives of the 1960s, including theories around major historical events. These ideas are not supported by evidence in police records, witness testimony, or established timelines of Rogers' life. Instead, they illustrate how unresolved mysteries can attract outlying speculation, not grounded in verifiable facts. What remains most puzzling across all theories is the complete absence of definitive evidence explaining either motive or Charles's fate. If Charles solved a financial conflict, emotional breakdown, or any other personal stressor led to violence, no corroborating testimony, letter, or documented conversation has ever surfaced to confirm it. Likewise, if Charles intended to flee, there is no confirmed sighting after June 1965, no travel record, no arrest, and no trace of any established identity under an alias. Years later, authorities declared him legally dead in 1975 because he had not been seen in a decade, a procedural step that acknowledges absence, not closure. The enduring absence of answers raises questions that continue to draw interest. Why did Charles leave without any known communication? Did he ever intend to return? Were there clues overlooked at the time that could reshape how the case is understood? Even now, decades later, the gaps in the story create fertile ground for new theories, reassessments of old evidence, and renewed curiosity among researchers. Ultimately, this case remains a tangle of unanswered questions and unresolved paths, a mystery that resists a single explanation and invites ongoing reflection. For the relatives of Fred and Edwina Rogers, life after June 1965 has not unfolded like a story with an ending. It has unfolded like one without a final page. In the years that followed their deaths, the absence of answers did not simply fade into the background. It became a defining force in their everyday lives. The Rogers family was left to carry a truth that has never been resolved. The people they loved were murdered, and the principal suspect, their own son, vanished without a trace. Unanswered questions have a way of becoming personal weights. Every holiday, every memory tied to Fred and Edwina's routines, a quiet Sunday dinner, the sound of conversation in the living room, the way they used to greet visitors at the door, serves as a reminder of what was lost and what was never explained. Family members have spoken of ongoing frustration and sadness, not just for the tragedy itself, but for the lack of closure. The psychological toll is not limited to a moment in time, it reverberates through decades. The emotional strain is compounded by the way the case unfolded. Instead of a trial, there was only absence. Instead of testimony from a suspect, there was silence. Instead of a verdict, there were theories. The Rogers family has lived in a space where facts merge with speculation, and certainty never settles. This uncertainty has functioned as its own form of punishment because it leaves open every possible question about motive, about responsibility, and about the fate of the one person who might have held the answers. The emotional impact extends beyond Fred and Edwina's immediate family. Neighbors who once walked past their home now associate the address with unanswered horror. Communities that followed the case in its early days have watched discussions and theories flourish over decades, yet none have delivered clarity. Even the passage of time has not softened the emotional edge of the story, because the core mystery remains intact. Who killed the Rogers couple, and where did their son go? In the end, the Rogers case stands as a reminder that some stories do not offer relief through resolution. The absence of answers can become a presence of its own, one that families carry quietly but persistently, long after news headlines fade. As we return to that fateful moment, the refrigerator door swinging open and the discovery that shook Houston in June 1965, one question still cuts through the decades. What really happened to Charles Rogers? The case of Fred and Edwina Rogers remains officially unsolved, and the absence of answers has become as haunting as the crime itself. Over the years, investigators chased leads, interviewed witnesses, and examined every piece of evidence they could find. Yet, no one has ever located Charles after that day. No confirmed sighting, no arrest, no trace that could put the pieces together for good. Investigators eventually declared him legally dead in 1975, not because his guilt was proven, but because his disappearance had persisted for a decade with no resolution. Is this a case that will ever be solved? Could new evidence or fresh perspectives finally bring clarity to what happened in that quiet Houston home? Or will this mystery remain buried in the shadows of time? Another unsolved chapter in American true crime. These are questions that continue to draw interest and debate. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think was missed in the investigation? Could Charles still be out there undiscovered, or does the truth lie somewhere unexpected? How many stories like this are still waiting to be told, still waiting for answers? If this case intrigues you, like, subscribe, and join the conversation below. Share your thoughts, theories, and reflections, not just for Fred and Edwina Rogers, but for all the mysteries that remain unresolved, because every unanswered question deserves to be heard.